Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this the first meeting of the Joint Economic Committee for the 113th session of Congress to order. The Employment Act of 1946 established the Joint Economic Committee to analyze economic issues and make policy recommendations to Congress. And as the 37th chairman of the committee, I want to congratulate Senator Amy Klobuchar on becoming vice chair and welcome both new and returning members to the committee. I would like to introduce our new members: Representative Eric Paulson of Minnesota, Representative Richard Hanna of New York, Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, Senator Christopher Murphy of Connecticut, Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico, and Representative John Delaney of Maryland. While the United States confronts many problems, our most vexing economic challenge is the growth gap and how we close it. The growth gap between this economic recovery and other recoveries is significant and intensifies our federal spending and debt problems. The growth gap has two interrelated aspects. First, by objective economic measures, the recovery that began in June 2009 remains the weakest among recoveries since World War II. Second, according to many economists, our economy's potential to grow over time has slowed. If true, the average rate of growth and private job creation during this recovery of 2.1% annually and 175,000 new jobs per month, respectively, are about as good as our economy will ever perform in the future, and that is unacceptable. Therefore, it's appropriate the first hearing of the committee should address this growth gap. Why have economic growth and job creation remained weak, and what should Congress do to boost them? The anemic nature of the current recovery is indisputable. During the current recovery, real GDP increased by 7.5% in 3.5 years. By contrast, average real GDP growth during the same period in all the post-war recoveries was 17.5%. Today's recovery is less than half as strong as the average. Real GDP would have to grow at an annual rate of 5.5% in each of the next 4 years merely to catch up with an average recovery by the end of President Obama's second term. That would be slightly higher than the 5.4% annual rate that President Reagan achieved during the first 3.5 years of the Reagan recovery. Private payroll employment, that is jobs along Main Street, have increased by only 5.7% since its cycle low. Had this recovery been merely average, private payroll employment would have increased by 9.4%. The growth gap means the United States should have 3.9 million more private jobs today than it does. Equally troubling is mounting evidence that the annual growth rate for potential real GDP in the future has fallen dramatically. In its most recent budget and economic outlook, the Congressional Budget Office cut its estimate of the potential real GDP growth rate to 2.3%. 1 percentage point below its average since 1950. 1 percentage point may not sound like much. However, the real economy doubles in 22 years at 3.3% growth rate, but at that lower, smaller rate, it takes 31.9 years to double, almost a decade longer. The prospect of a new normal for America's economy, in which our future economic growth permanently slows by 1/3, should be a red flag for all Americans. During this Congress, the committee will, through hearings and research, investigate the growth gap and how to close it. No doubt some of the growth gap may be due to demographic factors that are not so easily amenable to economic policy. However, even a cursory review of recent history strongly suggests that economic and fiscal policies have played the dominant role. To understand how these policies affect performance, let us compare the generally pro-growth policies and the superior performance of the U.S. economy during the 1980s and 1990s with the generally slow growth policies and the lackluster performance during the last decade. During the Great Moderation, under both Republican and Democratic presidents and Congresses with Republican, Democrat, and split control, the federal government generally pursued pro-growth economic policies and achieved outstanding results. The size of the federal government, as measured by federal spending, gradually shrank relative to the size of the economy. Marginal income tax rates fell. Policymakers focused on reducing the after-tax cost of capital for new business investment, and jobs grew. monetary policy became increasingly rules-based and predictable. Ignoring the employment half of its dual mandate, the Federal Reserve focused on price stability. The regulatory burden on businesses and households declined, and the United States led the world in liberalizing international trade and investment. Beginning in 2001, under both Republican and Democratic presidents and Congresses with Republican, Democrat, and split control, the federal government reversed course, in large part due to the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and the results have been disappointing. The size of the federal government has grown substantially relative to the size of the economy, soaring to 25.2% of GDP and remaining elevated at an estimated 22.2% of GDP during the current fiscal year. Marginal income tax rates were first decreased, then increased. In recent years, policymakers have primarily focused on the fairness of the tax system instead of its effect on growth. Monetary policy has become discretionary once again. The Federal Reserve has justified its extraordinary actions based upon the employment half of its dual mandate. The regulatory burdens on businesses and households has increased, generating uncertainty and inhibiting new business investment. The United States has fallen behind its major trading partners in liberalizing international trade and investment. Today is the perfect time to focus on the growth gap and what we should do about it. Given the historical and legal relationship between the Joint Economic Committee and the Council of Economic Advisors, it's appropriate that two of the most distinguished former chairmen, Dr. Michael Boskin and Dr. Austin Goolsbee, are with us today as witnesses. With that, I look forward to their testimony. I recognize Vice Chairman Klobuchar for her comments.
Well,